Episode 19, An Icy Predicament. It had been a hectic few months at work, and Jim thought that it was finally time for a family vacation. Jim, his wife Shima, and their two sons packed their bags and flew over to another side of the world with icy cold weather, where they got the chance to be far away from the hot, humid, and hectic everyday life of their city. However, one day's incident at a snowfield made Jim and his family confused, scared, and wondered what actually happened that day. It was a cold afternoon at a snowfield that stretched for miles, where tourists were allowed to rent and drive four-wheelers in the area. Jim drove the car with his family in it, and after driving for an hour, several miles away from the main area, they reached an uneven part of the snowfield. Jim predicted that it would be a bumpy ride, but thrived on the idea of crossing it as it was part of the whole adventure experience. Jim stepped on the accelerator and headed straight into the path. Unfortunately, the front right tire sunk into the cracks, and as Jim stepped on the gas in an attempt to free the tire, it sunk in deeper. Jim hopped out of the car while his family stayed inside. He went to the boot to search for suitable tools to get the car out of the predicament. However, after 30 minutes of trying various methods to get the car out, Jim realized that they couldn't do so, and since their phones had no signal, they had to search for help. Realizing that the sky would turn dark soon, Jim decided to venture further out on foot while his family waited in the car. At this point, Jim was slightly annoyed with his family as they stayed quiet throughout the whole ordeal without showing any initiative to help solve the predicament they had at hand. They merely sat quietly in the car. After walking for a couple of miles, with now the car barely visible to him, Jim saw a wooden hut a few hundred meters up ahead, on a diverted path away from the main trail. However, thinking that it might have been a guard post for the area, Jim strode over. Shortly after, Jim arrived, and standing right in front of him was a wooden home. Jim wondered to himself, why is there a home out in the snowfield so far off the drive trail? Regardless of its odd location, Jim knew that he needed help. So he knocked on the front door and said, "Hello, anyone inside?" After knocking on the door a couple of times, there was no response. Jim pushed the wooden door open, and realizing that it was unlocked, Jim slowly opened it, but worried that he might be rudely intruding in someone's home. Jim peeked his head in to see if there was anyone inside. As Jim's eyes briefly scanned in the home, there was no one. It was empty and eerily looked abandoned. A wood stove sat at a corner of the living room and looked both rusty and dusty. Next to it were old kitchen utensils neatly laid on its wooden shelves. Jim slowly entered the home, and just to be sure that there was no one in, Jim said, "Hello? Sorry, but my car is stuck and I need help." With no response, Jim was confident that no one lived in the small house and walked into the nearest bedroom. As Jim barely entered the bedroom, he heard footsteps coming from the living room. Jim turned to see who it was. However, there was no one there. Curious at the footsteps sounds he heard, Jim walked back to the living room to see if there was indeed anyone there. Just as Jim began walking, he heard as though someone was talking to himself back in the bedroom he entered earlier. Jim thought to himself, "That's weird. I was sure there wasn't anyone inside." Slightly spooked now as he suddenly realized that the house had a very eerie feel since he came in, but didn't think much of it as he was focused in searching for help, Jim became hesitant in exploring further. Jim wanted to go back to meet his family and find another way to search for help. However, as he was about to leave, a part of him knew that it wasn't a good idea, as there was nothing back at the car that could help. So Jim continued rummaging through the living room area. As he was doing so, Jim suddenly heard sounds from another bedroom. Jim slowly walked over, and as he was standing outside the room with its door already open, Jim again saw no one inside. But strangely, there was an old rocking chair that was still rocking back and forth as though someone had just gotten off of it. While gradually getting more freaked out now, and still had his eyes closely locked on the rocking chair, Jim suddenly heard the sound of a child's giggle coming from the living room. Jim turned to look at the living room to see where the sound was coming from, but again, no one was there. After briefly considering the situation he was in, and the countless times that he heard sounds but with no one around, this was a sign to him to leave the place before things got worse. With his heartbeat beginning to race, Jim walked towards the front door as he wanted to leave, but before he could reach the exit, the wooden door slammed shut. Then, the rocking chair from the bedroom began rocking again. Gradually, the sound got louder and faster, as though someone was aggressively rocking it. From the other bedroom, he began hearing the same child's giggles and footsteps from earlier. But now, the footsteps of the child now seemed to get closer. Frightened, but didn't want his vulnerable back to face whatever was behind him, Jim turned around. At the other end of the living room, he saw an elderly man holding the hand of a little girl, with both of them standing side by side and staring right at Jim. With a smile, the pale-looking elderly man said, "Where are you going? Stay with us." The little girl then said, "Yeah, play with us. Don't leave yet," putting on a brave front without realizing that he was actually shivering in fear. Jim looked right at them and said, "No, I'm going back to my family." Jim turned and gave a hard pull on the makeshift wooden doorknob as it swung open. He ran out as fast as he could in the cold, snowy weather back to his family. As he was still running, he could still hear faint sounds of the child from the house that said, "Come back, where are you going?" followed by faint giggles. Within 10 minutes, Jim finally saw his car in the distance. As he sprinted towards it, Jim reached the car, and to his bewilderment, he saw no one in it. Shima and their 2 sons were not there. Jim looked around, but there were no traces of them. Panicked and worried that something might have happened to them, Jim continued looking around into the distance. Suddenly, from a distance, Jim saw red and blue blinkers from a couple of vehicles heading towards him. The vehicle stopped a few meters in front of him, and he could now see that they were police vehicles. Then all the car doors swiftly opened. Jim saw Shima and his 2 sons run towards him and hugged him. Jim was confused as to what was going on, but relieved that his family was fine. Jim thought that maybe while he was away earlier, the police found them and brought them back to the main area. But Jim found it odd that if the police had found his family, why didn't they go further ahead to search for him, since his family knew the exact direction that he went towards? As Jim was still deep in his thoughts, Shima then suddenly broke Jim's train of thoughts and asked, "Why did you go out on your own, dear?" "What do you mean, darling? I told you guys I was going to go further up in front to search for help," explained Jim. "What are you talking about, dear? This morning, after we picked up the car, we went for breakfast at a nearby cafe, remember? While we were still eating, you suddenly went out, drove off, and disappeared. For an hour, we tried to search and call you, but we couldn't reach you. We got so worried that something might have happened that we called the police," said Shima. "Wait, are you serious? After breakfast, I remember clearly we drove for an hour together out here in the snowfield. You guys were quiet all the while, but I thought you guys were just tired and not in the mood to talk," said Jim. "No, we didn't, Dad. We were all still eating. You drove off on your own," said one of Jim's sons. Hearing this, Jim became utterly confused. Jim retraced the day's events all the way to that very spot, confident that he was with his family throughout the day. One of the police officers then interrupted Jim's thoughts and said, "Sir, what they said is true. The cafe's camera footage showed that you drove off on your own this morning. If it makes you feel any better, this isn't the first time that we see this happen. We just couldn't figure out why it's been happening." Jim stood there, confused and speechless, wondering if this was all just a dream, a nightmare to be exact. Seeing that the sun was beginning to set, the police officers assisted with Jim's car and got the tire finally unstuck as the family drove back together with the police. They enjoyed the rest of the holiday, with Shima paying very close attention to Jim, making sure that he doesn't drift off on his own again. What happened that day was still a mystery to Jim and his family. From his wife to his kids during the snowfield drive, from the grandpa to his granddaughter at the wooden home, every bit of it that Jim saw that day felt all too real.